Good evening, everybody. I think I know most of you. My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm Director of the Center for Canadian Studies here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. It's great to have you, but mostly because it's great to have our speaker. And I wanted a great audience for Andrew Holman, who is the author of the book, The Flyer is on Your Chair, Hockey, A Global History. I've known Andrew for a while. He's very active in the Association for Canadian Studies in the U.S. He's our treasurer, so he knows where all the money is, which is very important. When I first met him, he was at Bridgewater State. He's now the director of the Canadian Studies program at Bridgewater State. And really, it's one of the great schools that does Canadian studies. It's just a handful now that really churn out great graduates, and I think yours is one of the programs we all look to for your contributions, but particularly for your contributions on history. And this is not Andrew's first book on the history of hockey. He's written several others, including The Same But Different, a book about hockey in Quebec. But this, I think, is going to go down as his great opus. There's a copy of the book here. It has an encyclopedic review of hockey literature. For someone who's interested in this field, this is the book you can go to, find the citation to make the point that you want to make. It's absolutely a fantastic book. I encourage you to read it. One small note, the flyer that's on your chair is from the publisher, and if you use the promo code, you can get 30% off the book, which is, I think, very nice of the publisher, which is University of Illinois Press, so I wanted to give them a plug. So with that, let me turn to Andrew to give a presentation. We'll do Q&A. So, Andrew, please.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Chris, and thanks to all of you for coming out to listen to me talk a little bit about hockey. Thanks to SAIS as well. For hosting this and giving us the space. I'd like to begin with a personal anecdote. In December of 2016, I was invited to give a paper in Moscow at the inaugural World Hockey Forum, a conference for academics and administrators and for coaches and for others who study or work in the sport of hockey. It was hosted by the Russian Ice Hockey Federation, and as president, then, Vladislav Tretiak, some of you will have heard his name before. The Russian Ice Hockey Federation was celebrating its 70th anniversary in high style. As I've come to learn, they do everything over there. The conference itself was a terrific experience, and I got to meet several of the Russian hockey greats. But the biggest thrill for me came away from the conference. About 3 weeks before leaving for Moscow, I told some of the guys in my Thursday night beer league hockey pickup game that I was going to go to Moscow, and they were happy for me and thought this is wonderful. And then there was a pregnant pause before one of them, a guy called Steve Salvucci, a former International Hockey League player, asked me, "Are you bringing your bag?" Well, I'd never thought of it, though I bring my hockey equipment with me often when I travel to Canada or to parts of New England. It's a great way to meet people and to have some fun and to get a sweat, particularly if you've been drinking lots of beer. Could I arrange for a pickup hockey game in Russia? And how would I do that? And who would know anyone in Moscow? So the next day, I emailed Aaron Annable, who's just come in the room, Aaron, a Canadian diplomat who had recently been transferred from the consulate in Boston to here, the embassy in D.C. Aaron, do you know someone in the Canadian Embassy in Moscow who might know someone in that city who plays pickup hockey and might have room for another skater or two on this specific date? And thank you, Aaron. He said he would try. So here's how small the world of ice hockey is. In only about a few hours, and after about 4 emails, I heard from 2 guys, one guy called Evgeny, another guy called Vitaly, who invited me to play with their group on the Seska or Red Army rink on a Sunday night. No charge, arms wide open to welcome me. And so I did, along with a colleague of mine from Brock University, Dr. Julie Stevens. Where do I press for this? Oh, here we go. It was surreal. Everything was different and everything was the same. The soaring Soviet-esque murals and trophy cases marking Russian hockey greatness told the stories of international glory from a totally different perspective from the one I was used to seeing and hearing about growing up in Canada. But the hockey was totally the same. The same stuff I'm used to, a very slowish pace, 3 guys who never pass the puck, three more guys who refuse to back check, 1 goalie who's temperamental, 1 guy who's a bit too heavy on the stick. You know about all of this stuff, right? And 1 guy there's only 1 guy, right, who celebrates just a little too much after scoring a goal. All of that was there. And of course, 20 players who laugh hard with one another in the dressing room afterwards. So hockey is global now, and the fact is played out nightly in the games of the National Hockey League and in Russia's KHL, in NCAA women's hockey and in world and Olympic tournaments, in coaching clinics and coaching exchanges. Ty Newberry is here, who has signed on to help coach the Lithuanian national team, which recently had a big success, I'm told, right? The B Pool Victors. Fantastic. Occasionally we see globalization in local pickup games like the one I played in Moscow as well. How hockey got to be global is the story that Steve Hardy and I begin to tell in our new book, Hockey: A Global History. Here's 20 guys laughing together. There's me on the far left taking a knee next to guys who I don't know. One of these guys in the dressing room afterwards, I think only 3 or 4 of them had much in the way of English, and this was December of 2016. So one of them, after having a beer and screwing up his courage, said, "Okay, I have a question." And I said, "Okay, what's your question?" He said, "Do Americans really think that Russians interfered in the election?" And I said, "Yes, because you did." Here's Dr. Julie Stevens here from Brock. Well, our book traces the development of hockey over the past 200 years. There's Steve Hardy there. From an unorganized outdoor northern pastime called by many shinny to a rule-bound indoor high-tech commercial spectacle played around the world in warm climates as well as in cold climates. And, as we argue, governed rigidly by transnational and international bureaucracies like the National Hockey League, the International Ice Hockey Federation, USA Hockey, and Hockey Canada. We tell the story of hockey's predecessors, like bandy and polo. Its formal birth in Montreal in 1875 amongst a group of former McGill students, and its geographic spread far and wide all across Canada by 1895, into the northern United States by the early 1900s, in England, Scotland, France, Bohemia, and Italy in the 1910s, Scandinavia, Germany, Australia in the 1920s, and of course Russia in 1946. We also tell the uneasy story and the difficult story of hockey's demographic spread too, and this is important. How a sport invented by white, middle-class, English-speaking men became embraced and owned by women and by people of other racial and ethnic backgrounds as well. So, like so many histories and stories about globalization, ours too is about power. Who got to own and control the sport and how they did so. Hockey doesn't just spread around the world naturally or by happenstance. There's a pattern to its diffusion, and that pattern is motored by big global forces like commerce and ideology, imperial identities, social class, gender, race, and other things. So hockey wasn't always merely about having fun. It was administered and legislated for real-world reasons too. Okay, one more thing before I start reading a little bit here. We argue that hockey's global history can best be understood as having unfolded in 4 great periods. Let's see what I have here. What's that? I know, I wish we could have said 3, it just didn't fit. And that these periods are kind of held together by a pendular swing. Okay, so the period before 1875, when there was a diffuse variety of stick and ball games, like bandy and polo and shinty and other things played on the ice. The period from 1875 until 1920, the Montreal game being founded at the Victoria Skating Rink in March 4th of 1875. This is the game that we can pin our lineage to here. from 1875 to 1920 is what we might call the era of convergence, when a form of hockey becomes the form of hockey, and of course spreads not just across the continent but into Europe as well. From 1920 to 1972, which is a period we call an era of divergence, so when the Montreal game seed, after it's been disseminated elsewhere, it takes on lives of its own. Okay, so in Sweden or in France or in Belgium or in England, that seed is taken and given its own distinct spin and its own meaning as well. And then from 1972 until about 2010, we are historians after all, so we can really only, go so far towards the present. And 2010 is pushing it, I think, for us. Here we see the reemergence of convergence. In 1972, we had that very famous summit series that's played between the Soviet Union and Canada. Team Canada won heroically at the very last 34 seconds left in the game 8 by Paul Henderson, who scored Canada's most famous goal on a rebound. I'm not sure what that says about us as a country, but 1972 is important because it marks this period of convergence then, right? When Canadians and others decide that the world is too small for a variety of different forms of hockey to be played. And in terms of exchange of players, exchange of coaching ideas, we see a movement towards the middle. And the game of hockey becomes much more common, I suppose we might say that, than it had been in the previous 50 years. Okay, so there's our big category. I'd like to read some stories that come from this book, and perhaps I have time for 3, but maybe 4. We'll see. One of them is about Genesis, one's about sex, one's about violence, and one's about race. And you folks thought you were here to hear about hockey, pucks, and sticks. Let me start with talking about hockey's early days and how it first sort of takes shape and becomes a thing. I mentioned that we look at hockey's first game as having been played at the Victoria Skating Rink on the 4th of March, 1875. We say that it's the first documented game, right? It might have been played and probably was played as we know it well before then. But that's the game we know about because it was recorded in the Montreal Gazette. And after that point, we see a sort of continuous reportage about hockey as an event. And then in 1877, the Montreal Gazette, after a game is played, publishes the rules. And it's the publication of the rules that makes it a regular, predictable thing, that a game played in Montreal then can now be replicated and is expected to be replicated elsewhere. That's how a game becomes the game. But one of the biggest elements or factors that helps to put in place the Montreal game as the game of hockey has to do with the Montreal Winter Carnival. And had it not taken place in the 1880s, then we might not have the game today that we think of. Okay, the affair on the Victoria Skating Rink in March 1875 was a clever hybrid that borrowed heavily from hurley, shinty, rugby, lacrosse, and especially field hockey. Like rugby football, early hockey was an onside game that outlawed forward passing. More conspicuously, but for their skates and sticks, early hockeyists looked like rugby players, with distinctive costumes, striped sweaters, high stockings, and calf-length padded pants. From lacrosse came the goals, 2 6-foot poles placed 6 feet apart and sometimes adorned with flags on top. Lacrosse's 1 referee and 2 goal judges, 1 for each goal, recommended to hockey men the same system of policing. At the same time, the matches in the Victoria Rink possessed at least 2 unborrowed traits: 9 men aside and a wooden disc as the object of players' pursuits, not a vulcanized rubber puck until 1876. The first written rules then were hardly a comprehensive delineation of the game. They were grafted onto the sport as it was being played. But things changed quickly. According to newspaper reports in 1880, Montreal teams had, by convention, reduced the number of players to 8 per side and settled on the appropriate span for a contest duration: 2 30-minute periods with a 10-minute intermission. This was the sport an improved version which entered the 1880s. And here is an historical contingency. The new game was hatched and nurtured just before the Montreal business community and city leaders decided to sell their city and its attractions to wealthy visitors through an annual pageant called the Montreal Winter Carnival. The idea was simple. By hosting a carnival, a seasonally depressed local economy could pitch its industry, its modern buildings, its transportation facilities, and its unique cultural character through a celebration of Nordicity. And the plan worked. One observer noted upwards of 50,000 visitors attended the Carnival Week festivities held in Montreal in 1883, 84, 85, 87, and 89. They came from other Canadian cities, from across the U.S., and from as far afield as England, Germany, and Havana. Montreal became a winter resort so that international visitors might see for themselves how Canadians had mastered the climate and, far from suffering in the winter, could relish its health-giving benefits. Though hockey was included from the start among the panoply of winter doings, one point is clear. Hockey needed the Montreal Winter Carnival more than the carnival needed hockey. The venues changed over the years. The first carnival tournament was played on the St. Lawrence River in February 1883 among 3 teams, McGill, the Montreal Victorias, and a side from Quebec City. Since the latter could only field a 7-man team, the other 2 teams followed suit. The tournament was first organized by the Victoria Hockey Club and, after 1884, the Montreal Hockey Club. Representatives from these clubs determined the direction of the carnival's programs and subscribed the money, and teams competed for a coveted prize, the Silver Berks Cup. In a broader historical context, the carnival survived long enough to provide an important platform to showcase a new sport's worth. The carnival shaped and spread the Montreal game in its early years for at least 3 reasons. The first of them involved form. In 1884, the Carnival Tournament Committee confirmed the previous year's decision to play 7-man hockey. And it stuck. The 7-man game created space for skating and stick handling, passing and shooting, a faster, more exciting version that lasted in Eastern Canada until 1911, when the National Hockey Association decided to reduce the number from 7 to 6, so it had to pay fewer people. True. And longer in Western Canada and the United States. For the ill-fated 1886 tournament, a clear and augmented set of rules were set out, and all invited teams abided by those. And those new rules were published in the Montreal Star in 1886. Second, the Winter Carnival exposed this still new pastime to audiences of visitors who had the potential to help it grow. Hockey did not have to rely solely on its early advocates, its evangels, as we call them in the book, to spread the word to the unwashed far afield. The carnival brought people to the venue, to Montreal. A final point dovetails with the second. It was during the Montreal Winter Carnival that hockey found its most famous patron and potentially influential backer. Who would guess who it was? You got him. Oh, I put him up there already. Her Majesty's newly appointed representative of the Government of Canada, Frederick Arthur Lord Stanley, the first Baron of Preston. Archivist James Whalen writes, in February 1889, Lord Stanley witnessed his first hockey match at the Montreal Winter Carnival when the Montreal Victorias defeated the Montreal AAA team by a score of 2-1. Expressing, and I quote, his great delight in the game of hockey and the expertness of the players, Stanley became a regular and distinguished spectator. 3 years later, he donated a challenge trophy for the amateur hockey champions of the Dominion. And there's the cup there. Of course, you recognize that as being only part of the modern-day cup. Has several tiers below it now. Circumstance had intervened. The carnival was dying in 1889, but it still had the power to proclaim the game. The Montreal Winter Carnival happened at a critical time for ice hockey. It provided a popular national and international venue for a new sport and stamped it as a symbol of Canadian winter. It kept a fledgling game aloft. It ennobled, legitimated, and set up for widespread growth of the sport in the following decade. So Steve and I go on in the book and talk a little bit more then about what happens after the Carnival. This is the point when it becomes legitimated and regularized. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to grow much beyond Montreal, but it does. In the 2 decades after 1885, we see that hockey gets spread far and wide. It gets spread through particular evangels, as we call them, individuals who love the game so much that they take it with them to Winnipeg and to Edmonton and to Kingston and to Toronto, where they bring the equipment with them and branded this branded Montreal game to other contexts. They take it with them on the railway, and the railway is critical here as well, right, because it determines where hockey is going to grow. And they take it to places where regular ice is available, in those cities that have artificial ice already in place, or at least enclosed buildings with ice, and of course to those parts of the country that have ice because it's so cold regularly for several weeks throughout the winter. So again, it doesn't happen by happenstance, it just goes there. Steve and I also go on and talk not just about hockey spreads, how hockey spreads across Canada and into the United States, but how it hops the pond in the 1890s and 1900s into places like England and into Belgium and into Italy, ultimately into Scandinavia, and into France, where Louis Magnus, who is this journalist and whirlwind, takes up the game as his own mission and establishes in 1908, invites other nations, European nations, to come with him and to form the Ligue Internationale de Hockey sur Glace, what becomes the International Ice Hockey Federation in the 1950s. And so by the end of the 19-teens, hockey has this kind of foothold or beachhead in a number of different northwestern European countries. And it's those footholds then that lead to another important event. That's the Antwerp Olympics of 1920. Summer Olympics, as it was. The first Olympic hockey tournament is played in the summer. So let me talk a little bit, read a little bit about this as well. Hockey's initial phase of convergence, 1877-1920, culminated in April 1920 at the Antwerp Olympics. These games reflected both the ravages of war and the efforts to revitalize. Germany and Austria were not invited to compete, and Belgium still looked much like a war zone. As one Olympic historian put it, the facilities were far from ideal, the track was poorly built, athletes complained about the inadequate accommodations and poor facilities. Some events didn't go off until September, but it was, as I say, a major moment for hockey. 7 teams competed in the competition: France, Belgium, Sweden, Switzerland, Czechoslovakia, the United States, and Canada, which was represented by the Winnipeg Falcons. Here we have them, the winners of the Allen Cup. Tournament play, like the rest of the games, was organized under a modified Bergvall system, as it was called, named after a Swedish journalist and a member of the Swedish Olympic Committee. A draw determined the opening brackets of a single elimination play tournament called the A tournament, or the gold medal round. The teams who lost to the gold medal winner played in the B tournament. Then there was a C tournament as well for others who lost twice, but still wanted to compete for the bronze medal. Well, as predicted, Canada and the United States were expected to finish 1 and 2, and they did. Rather convincingly. Canada played Czechoslovakia in the first round and won 15-0. United States played Switzerland and beat them 29-0. Then Canada played the U.S. in the second round and won 2-0. Canada played Sweden in the gold medal game and won 12-1. So when we think these days about how concerns that the Olympic Committee has about how non-competitive women's Olympic hockey is, and that it's in danger of being dropped. We've heard this for the past 2 Olympics because Canada and the U.S. are so far ahead of all the other teams that it doesn't seem competitive. Well, those people who make the complaints should look back to the 1920s. This kind of disparity existed not just in 1920, but again in 24 and 28 too. The Canadians and Americans impressed the Europeans with their skill and their equipment. Canada's Frank Frederickson And America's Moose Goheen were especially awesome to the Europeans. One Swedish news writer described the scene this way. When the boys saw the Canadians and the Americans play for the first time, they first looked silently on the play and then on one another, and when they said with one voice, "I'll be darned." I'm not really sure they would have said quite that, but it's a good way to imagine it. You see, these chaps really could play in a way you never had known. The swiftness, the quick turns and dribbling, the recklessness and mastery with which they shot the puck with extraordinary speed into the goal made one's head spin. It captivated and thrilled the spectators so that they could not keep quiet, but had to shout and applaud and excite themselves as if they were a Storm and Munson audience. These were Swedish evangelists of the time, speaking with tongues instead of decent, ordinary people with an interest in sports. One Belgian reporter added, "Among the Americans, play appears second nature. They are admirable, and no wonder some women become slightly hysterical while watching their brilliant play." What happens after the tournament is that the Americans and the Canadians donate all of their equipment to European teams. You can see some of the difference here between the equipment that the Swiss are holding. I mean, if you look at some guy who's playing hockey against you with bare knees, what would be the first thing that occurred to you? Well, okay, compared to the Winnipeg Falcons, who are well organized here. Beside the face-to-face competition and the transfer of equipment, the Antwerp Games were a landmark in several ways. Most important, the LIHG and other hockey enthusiasts had convinced the International Olympic Committee to place their sport on the Olympic roster for good, not just as an exhibition. And so this gave hockey an inside position as the premier winter team sport in Europe. It leapfrogs ahead of bandy and polo, which maintained some popularity throughout the 20th century. The Canadians and the Americans became the new models for emulation in playing styles, in coaching, and in equipment. And in its post-Olympics Antwerp meetings, the LIHG revised the international rules, shifting from 7-man to 6-man hockey. At the same time, and this is an important part too about how pivotal 1920 is, the Antwerp Games fueled the fires of national pride among continental teams. By joining the LIHG, Canada and the United States brought credibility to what was essentially a European governing body, and neither country would ever be satisfied by its political input into that group. I think that remains the case even today. And so the LIHG becomes a kind of a separate force for European hockey in rules and in competition. And so there's a paradox. At this very moment of convergence that takes place, when one version of a game on the ice stood ready as the dominant version, there's already cracks in the facade, splinters in the framework, and hockey begins to diverge in Europe, becomes something that European nations can grab for themselves to own and change and give its own meaning. Okay, enough for that talk about Genesis. The book goes on for a while and talks about different aspects, but I want to talk about sex now, if I could. And I'll do so briefly, but women's hockey, of course, doesn't take too much longer to begin than men's hockey did. The first organized games among women happened in Ontario in the 1890s. But it exists pretty much as a novelty until the 19-teens. Actually, it's during the First World War where in Canada and in parts of the United States, fully uniformed competitive women's teams hockey begins to be played. Intercity as well. Boston, New York, Cleveland, Philadelphia all have women's teams that travel and play against one another. And of course, by the late 19-teens in Ontario and Quebec and in Western Canada, even Saskatchewan, there are women's teams. One team in BC called the Vancouver Amazons that played against a team like the Fernie, BC Swastikas. I don't think you could name a team the Swastikas anymore, but they did in the 1920s. Anyway, I want to switch gears a little bit. Some of you might know the story about women's hockey in Canada and the United States, but not many people have spoken about the history of women's hockey in Europe. And in the 1920s and 30s, there was this really interesting burst of energy in that direction before it gets snuffed out. Not completely, but for a few decades until the 1970s when it gets picked up again. Excuse me. In Britain and France in the 1920s, we saw the rise of vigorous enthusiasm for female challenge series, leagues, and annual tournaments. In both countries, women's clubs scheduled friendly challenge matches against their countrywomen and club teams from abroad. The heyday stretches, here, I'll give you a visual here. The heyday stretches from 1926 until 1938, when a cross-channel hockey culture took root. Women skated in Manchester, Brighton, Southampton, and London, where a team called the London Lambs played at Wembley Stadium and drew fans and press coverage. Across the water, competitive teams such as the Chamonix Edelweiss Sporting Club and the CSHB Club in Brussels, Belgium, took to the ice. But Paris really was the core of continental women's hockey in the 1920s and 30s. Teams like the Flèche Noire, Droit au But, the Club de Sport d'Hiver, and the Gros Cailloux Sportif clubs played challenge matches in the Vélodrome d'Hiver and the Palais de Glace, routinely covered in newspapers like Le Figaro and Le Dimanche Illustré. Finally, from 1931 to 36, England and France put up national teams to play against each other for a purported European championship that was closely covered in the press. As in North America, hockey playing represented a new liberal outlet for women. In France, in particular, the game became a platform for the expression of a new modern womanhood. Hockey was both an activity and an aesthetic, an arena for new ideas about female movement, grace, style, and verve. French female hockeyists were among the first athletes to travel to their events in England by airplane, which of course was the technological symbol of modernity in the 1930s. And reports of the on-ice successes of the Paris Droit au But Club, On Target Club, were featured in a fashion magazine called L'Officiel de la Mode, alongside posed team photos of what were easily the most stylish hockey uniforms of any era. One surviving photo of the French national team deplaning at South London's Croydon Airport on Valentine's Day, 1931, shows 8 smiling, 8 smiling women in cloche hats and fur-trimmed coats over skirts, walking arm in arm, carrying fashionable handbags, flowers, and bundles of hockey sticks. One British aviator who was on hand at Croydon described it this way. I do a British accent, but I can't, so you can just imagine it. On Saturday, we witnessed the arrival of a French ladies' ice hockey team. They do not look so athletic as our own countrywomen who take up sports, but perhaps one had better leave it at that. In contrast, the English team was stolid and sturdy, led by its robust captain and goaltender, Miss Bubbles Umney, whom London's Daily Mirror headlined as 6-foot woman ice player, all in caps, and by Mona Friedlander, who was later a World War II aviatrix, whose imposing physicality on defense was noted in the Daily Mail. Now, quote, "When Miss Friedlander charged, somebody knew all about it. Once it was Mademoiselle Taulin, the referee blew his whistle, and the casualty was removed from the rink. Vive la différence." In both Britain and France, war decimated the women's game. It was disrupted in England by the need to reallocate labor power to resources and space. In post-war Britain, it was shouldered aside by a new cultural definition of the game as even more strenuously masculine, aggressive, and violent. Hockey was personified in those days by the rough-hewn Canadian troops who had dominated wartime competition in Britain. English audiences must have concluded that women could not conceivably return to that sort of game. In France, the end of women's hockey was even more blunt. It was simply outlawed. One historian noted, women's ice hockey in the hexagon disappeared brutalement due to the Second World War, though men's ice hockey somehow continued. The Federation of Ice Sports added an article in its rules expressly forbidding the practice of female ice hockey. And indeed, it's not till the 1980s that we begin to see the revival of women's hockey in places like France. Okay, so I've covered genesis and I've covered sex. Maybe gender. Sometimes just use the word sex to draw people in, my students. He's not really gonna, is he? Okay, so how about a little violence? One of the things that Steve and I do in this book is to talk, and Ty, you'll appreciate this. I'm an old hockey coach, so I can't help but throw a few X's and O's in there to talk about how the game has changed over time. One thing that is true about hockey ever since 1875 is that it's had three principal components. It's had speed and what we might call combination or science. Okay, so strategy for passing the puck. That changes quite a bit after 1929 when the forward pass. See, I've already started to bore people here, so maybe I better tug that back. And when the forward pass comes into play, but trying to figure out how to attack and how to defend based upon the existing rules is something subject to time change and to sensibility change. Speed, combination, the third, violence or mayhem. Mayhem has always been a part of hockey in some measure, and the real challenge among hockey solons has always been, how do we balance these three, and how do we keep violence at bay? Some of you will see that the current concern in hockey involves concussions, and putting in place rules that will minimize the kind of concussions that, as we're now understanding, are having late in life manifestations in terms of chronic traumatic encephalopathy and early onset dementia and other things in players who've been hit in the head again and again and again. So this is a crisis today, yes. Ken Dryden says we should outlaw hits to the head completely and treat it like face masking in football. Whether you meant to or not, doesn't matter. You're out of the game or you're penalized in a big way. Others suggest there are other things that we can do to minimize the violence of hockey and make it less an extreme sport, which it's become in so many ways. But that doesn't mean that it's been this, continuous crescendo of concern about violence. Concerns about violence have come in fits and starts. There were on-ice hockey deaths in one year, 1907, that caused great concern. And, of course, in the 1970s and 80s, particularly after the Summit Series of 1972, which many argue that Canada won solely because it beat up the Russians and played a more physical game than the Soviets were willing to play. So let me talk a little bit about one of these crisis moments about violence in hockey in the 1970s and 80s. There's a hilarious scene, one among many, in 1977's frighteningly popular film, Slapshot. How many have seen Slapshot? Okay, almost. My own wife hasn't seen Slapshot. Like so many successful comedic spoofs, it contains a telling grain of truth. This one about the state of hockey tactics in the 1970s and how far out of balance the game's central components of speed, science, and mayhem had drifted. In a playoff race with a lack of skating and scoring talent, facing the prospect of his Federal League team being folded, Charlestown Chiefs player coach Reg Dunlop, who's played by Paul Newman, decides that the only chance for success on the ice and at the box office is to goon it up. Leading a ragtag collection of Canadian minor league lifers, three bespectacled simpleton brothers called the Hansons, and an ex-college star, Dunlop has his work cut out for him. But his cynical tactics actually begin to bring wins. Toward the end of the film, the Chiefs visit the Hyannisport Presidents, and the gong show reaches new heights. Ahead 7-1, a Hanson brothers' goal celebration is interrupted when a foreign object is thrown from the stands and hits him in the head, knocking off his glasses. In response, he does the only logical thing any one of us would do. He climbs over the glass and goes into the stands after the fan. Several teammates follow, starting a huge melee that leaves the presidents bemused and leads the Hansons to jail. Do we remember this scene? Yeah? Okay. Sensing an opportunity for splashy press, Dunlop happily gives them over to the local police, who show up at the dressing room door. He says, "I throw up my hands. I can't control them anymore. They got to be punished. Will you do me a favor and put them behind bars?" In the next breath, he tells the Chiefs' general manager, Joe McGrath, played by Strother Martin, on the phone, "They're putting the Hansons away on trumped-up charges. Someone threw a monkey wrench. Yeah, it hit Jeff right in the face." No, they were defending the honor of Charlestown at the time. The boosters are behind us 100%. And so when McGrath shows up in Hyannisport to arrange the Hansons' bail price, which he finds too high and begins to dicker with the desk sergeant, Dunlop objects to the GM's dickering. Dunlop says, "You can't leave those guys in jail. They're folk heroes." The desk sergeant says, "They're criminals." Dunlop says, "Well, most folk heroes started out as criminals." Now, overblown caricature to be sure, but to unpack the scene is to parse something central to North American hockey's public image in the 1970s. The game had become a running joke, a modern Roman forum, a safety valve for the stress of modern life, a surrogate for real violence outside the glass. The new brutality delighted many and drew deep concern from others. And Slapshot, the film, had an odd career. The film's intended mockery of gratuitous mayhem faded. The dark humor, tribalism, and hypermasculinity grew magnetic among many players and fans. It all became a weird source of identity, a positive assertion of toughness and rule flouting. It was a celebration of hockey gangsterism, for which real examples were all too easy to locate. And I'll tell you, you've probably been on bus trips where this film has been shown again and again and again, and it just reinforces this sort of cultish feeling, right? These included Philadelphia's Broad Street Bullies, the designated hitmen on professional and major junior teams, and in one life-imitating art moment, brought a Boston Bruins player, Terry O'Reilly, and others really jumping the glass in a December 1979 game at Madison Square Garden to get at a fan who had allegedly sucker-punched his teammate Stan Jonathan. One MSG, Madison Square Garden television commentator, said, "O'Reilly's after somebody in the crowd, and they have sticks. There go the Bruins." You hate to see this. But of course, many didn't hate it at all. Violence took center ice for 2 decades. Right after Paul Henderson scored his famous goal in Moscow, went one frenetic account, hockey caught a bad cold that just kept getting worse. It was most visible among the pros. There was more violence generally, and especially in the form of fighting, no longer referred to in the NHL rules by the gentlemanly term fisticuffs. Always illegal, but punished so lightly in the NHL and the WHA, which comes into being in 1972, and in Canadian junior leagues that its strategic intimidation value outweighed its immediate deterrent of a major penalty. During the 1980s, one journalist claimed, NHL fans were virtually guaranteed at least one bout in every tilt. But fighting was even more prominent a feature in the game in the WHA, a league made up of a handful of ex-NHL stars, such as Bobby Hull, Gordie Howe, and Derek Sanderson, but also a great many less talented players for whom the rough stuff helped compensate for a want of skill. In the WHA, fighters brought in the casual fans, one league history noted, and many teams hyped the confrontations to sell tickets. Bobby Hull was, of course, Winnipeg Jets' big star, marquee player, and he got so disgusted by it all at one moment he staged a one-man, one-day strike in October 1975 to protest goonery, as he called it. But of course he earned a great deal of derision from his contemporaries and from fans, and his one-day strike resolved nothing. Eddie Shack said this, "I think Bobby Hull should have kept his mouth shut, because now guys will be aiming for him." Fighting became so intrinsic that it spawned a new specialization, the enforcer or goon, whose role it was not to skate, pass, or score well, but to protect the team's vulnerable stars from becoming strategic targets of assault. Moreover, routine violence, in-game hooking, slashing, and elbowing remained everyday occurrences, despite an old argument that the threat of fighting worked to reduce stick work and cheap tactics of the sort that Canadian and American teams had experienced when they played in European venues. It all ran to both the extraordinary and the mundane, a fact reflected in the statistics for penalty minutes per NHL team per game. In 1972-73, the NHL 16 teams amassed 15,610 minutes in penalties in 78 games, or 12.15 penalty minutes per team per game. Thereafter, that figure rose. 14.62 penalty minutes per game in 1975-76, growing to 1987-88, to an amazing 26.42 penalty minutes per team per game. Wow. Violence, of course, worked for many of these NHL teams. Here's the words of Punch Imlach, who's we see here on the upper right, former coach of Toronto and Buffalo in the NHL. They say that everything is fair in love and war, four-time Stanley Cup winning Toronto Maple Leafs coach Punch Imlach quipped in 1973. And as far as I'm concerned, this is war. If I know you've got a bad arm, I'm going to take a stick to it. If I know you've got a bad ankle, I'm going to try to get at it. If you can't play because you're hurt, that's tough. The pros were the most egregious, but the trend invaded amateur ranks as well. In an October 1976 Alberta Junior Hockey League game in which 43 penalties were called, a Spruce Grove player who was returning to action after sitting out a 5-game suspension for spearing was ejected again for spearing a Pincher Creek player and cutting his face for 20 stitches. And yet the league president refused to see it as anything more than a one-off incident. The Alberta government, by the way, disagreed and asked Crown attorneys across the province to begin to observe junior hockey games and lay charges where necessary. Okay, so all of this is important, but even more important because, as Steve and I try to show, the post-1972 North American hockey violence actually jumps the pond. Hockey in Europe becomes more violent based upon the Summit Series and its aftermath there. Tough tactics worked, and they worked not just in North America, but in Europe as well. There's a last little piece I'll read here before I finish. Clearly, the most notable transfer from North America to Europe was physical play. Though the European press decried loudly the over-the-top intimidation tactics of the Canadian assassins and thugs, as they were called by the European press in 1972, European strategists began to quietly consider the merits of a more robust style of play. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, it made its way into European hockey at all levels. One reason was because Europeans began to believe that a continued success at the highest levels required more toughness. On the eve of the 1975-76 exhibition series between the Soviet Red Army and Wings clubs and 8 different NHL teams, the Toronto Sun writer George Gross recalled watching Anatoly Tarasov, the great Soviet coach of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, watching Tarasov run a practice at Maple Leaf Gardens. Periodically, Tarasov whacked or slashed a player with his ever-present stick. "We do these things," he explained, "so our players get used to the tactics of the Canadians." But physical play was not reserved only for North American teams. Soviet players expressed it domestically, too. In one of the tightest races in years, the Toronto Star reported in February 1977, Spartak Moscow is in grave danger of losing its crown, and its players are resorting to good old-fashioned Canadian-style hitting to keep the opposition at bay. In one game, Summit Series veteran Alexander Yakushev, just inducted in the Hockey Hall of Fame, actually, 2 weeks ago, Alexander Yakushev drew 2 roughing penalties and a misconduct. The Swede, Lars Erik Schuberg, pinpointed the 1972 series as a turning point for European hockey. Ever since the Canada-Russia series, Europeans have become rougher. For one, the Russians are playing more of a Canadian-style game now. See, we often think about this as being a one-way cultural transfer, right? That after 1972, Canadians and Americans think we can't play this way anymore. We've got to adopt European ways. But it really was a two-way transfer. Bill Flynn, a former Boston University Terrier recruited to play for the Bremerhaven Owls of the German 2nd Division, told an American reporter in May of 1978, "Even in Europe, violence on the ice is part of the sport. There are some dirty German players, but that's part of the game." Violence and virulence continued to brand hockey in the popular imagination long after the 1970s and 80s passed, and the sport's bad cold hopped the Atlantic. Just as Swedish and Soviet Russian ice hockey have taken up elements of the Canadian and American style of hockey, one Swedish scholar of sport writes, the North American game has incorporated what it recognizes as the most valuable elements of European hockey. In this era of convergence, hockey became at once more global and smaller. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Well, I won't keep the audience from you very long. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your co-author, Stephen Hardy. His background is not as an historian primarily. How did he figure in the writing, and how did you work together?
He is a historian by training.
Okay.
Yeah, but he's a emeritus professor at University of New Hampshire, and he worked until his retirement in a kinesiology department. So he was the odd faculty member of that kind of a hybrid department. And originally this project was his project, and invited me to become part of it about 17 years ago. And so we had a few road bumps along the way, but that explains it. He was from Waltham, Massachusetts, and a hockey player himself, a hockey coach, and ultimately a scholar of sport. Yeah.
That brings up something I thought I wanted to draw you out on a little bit more about the American history and the interaction between the Canadian and the U.S. side of this.
Yeah.
How hockey was first introduced here and where it went.
Right. It's funny, Baltimore and Washington were places where the game was first brought down by Canadian evangels, if you want to call them that, in the mid-1890s. As in so many ways, Canadian students traveling abroad, being part of university communities, brought the sport with them and their culture with them. And in places like Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, other places that had indoor ice arenas that could guarantee ice all year round, oddly, I mean, you'd think a place like Vermont or a place like Minnesota might be the first place where hockey first takes root, but it wasn't. And then universities pick it up. Harvard picks it up, Brown, Columbia, and Cornell a little bit later, but in the mid-1890s. So it's a combination in America in the 1890s, 1900s of university-based hockey playing, but also club teams in commercial rinks that are owned by rink managers that sell tickets, and and the major eastern cities are all involved. Yeah, it's Canadians as the kind of carriers of this cultural transport. The fact that they do so is kind of a double-edged blade. And you know, it's a carrying Canada's winter sport abroad and sharing it with Americans is one good thing, and you see this in articles that are written in magazines like Outing Magazine or even in the local press. But then fairly quickly it becomes clear that the violence with which the game is played is not for everybody's or to everybody's taste in the United States. And so this funny debate emerges in the early 20th century in America, in places like New York and Boston and Cleveland and Philadelphia. And that is, we love hockey, but do we want to play hockey the Canadian way? And is there an American way that we can do this? Is there an American style? That torch is picked up by American coaches like Ralph Windsor, who coached for more than 20 years at Harvard and with the Boston Amateur Athletic Association. And he actually calls it the American system. And it involves a different way of forechecking. I won't bore you with the X's and O's, but and less violence, which is important. Now, the flip side of the irony is that Canadians begin to complain about Americans in the 1920s and 30s after the NHL arrives in the United States, Boston first in 1924, New York in 1925-26, and that the commercial aspect of it, the kind of crowd's bloodlust, is what pushes Canadians to be violent when they play the game. So the origin of violence is, depending on, you know, you pick your interpretation. Is it an American thing that's thrust on poor old Canadians? Or do Canadians import that?
I was thinking about, you know, why people put ice indoors in the first place. And one of the other great things you see in Olympic hockey is figure skating, and that's often seen as women and then hockey as men, but actually it goes both ways. Did figure skating have an effect, a finesse effect maybe, in the way that hockey players saw their art?
It's a good question. There is a connection. Of course, the infrastructure is important. It's pleasure skating that first motivates the putting a roof on winter, as Michael McKinley has called it. Pleasure skating and figure skating, and so there is the kind of that provided the venue for which commercial hockey could first be played. George Mahar was a Canadian champion fancy skater, as they would have called it at the time, who was one of the proponents who brought the game to places in Europe as well. But I think if you asked some of the early hockey players if they had anything to learn from figure skaters, they would have loudly denied it. Now, I know Melissa's smiling here because she knows that things have come completely full circle right now since the 1980s, maybe the 1970s. Hockey teams have hired former figure skating coaches to teach them to do edge work better and to be more balanced on their blades. And we call it power skating now, right? We would never call it fancy skating or figures, power skating. But there is that connection for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, let's bring this out to the audience. If anyone has a question, no rules. Professor Durant?
Revealing my ignorance. But is there kind of a story behind the Slapshot? Has to be the most incredible thing in sports to see that executed well.
Yeah.
But is there a story of how this various types of
Right. There's about 6 stories that claim that the Slapshot started here or there. One of them, one of the more interesting one, is that there was a short-lived all-African-Canadian league in the Maritimes in the late 1890s until about 1905. And one of the claims is made there, not just by historians but by contemporary sources, that the Slapshot started there. Also, another innovation was that that league allowed for goalies to flop on the ice, where it was outlawed elsewhere. But the Slapshot is it has had a really funny career, if you think about it. It's something that coaches today will advise their players to use only in certain scenarios, because if you miss the net, well, it's going the other way, right? Or you hit your own players, particularly with the sort of technology that's available today. And yet it's still this kind of calling card of the game, isn't it? You know, Bobby Hull and his Slapshot. Yeah. So it's not a good answer to your question, but the Slapshot sort of has more resonance, I think, in the discourse about the game than in the game itself. The X's and O's taught by coaches are really much more about other stuff. Yeah.
Professor Warby?
I have 2 questions about the Stanley Cup and one about speed. Since the Stanley Cup is presently in our city.
Did I not mention that?
And you showed it and you said something about cheers. Is that what's on today, is that connected to the original?
Yes.
Showed us in terms of the
It is. Yeah, that's the very top. And then they've added collars on gradually and then a cylinder in the bottom.
oh, we all know.
And
Everybody in D.C.'s touched it or seen it.
right. Get out the Purell, right?
Yeah, so it's the original. Okay.
Except that if you were to keep all of the names and all of the rings on, it would be even longer. So they've had to edit it and to take off some of the rings and move them up so that there's more space for everybody. Yeah.
And speed, one of the things that's always struck me when you're at a game, just the incredible speed. Is that a gradual thing? Was that right from the start? Or
Yeah.
was it just suddenly?
It has to do with two things. Technology, number one. Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of those images, will show you the skates that they used to wear back at the turn of the 20th century and how they change over time. The development of the tube skate, which is lighter than the old heavy metal skates that used to clip on or attach to boots. And then the development of the toque blades, which are light as air these days. That has something to do with it. But it also has to do with the athletes. You know, we're talking here about athletes who train year-round, who do clinics in the summer, who do specialized exercise for gaining thrust for their skating. There's a great document that I came across in the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association archives about a month ago that speaks to the difference between the way athletes used to train and what they do now. It's a letter from Punch Imlach when he was coaching the Toronto Maple Leafs. It's a form letter to people who have been invited to the Toronto Maple Leafs training camp that's going to start in September. And the letter's hilarious because it says, to be eligible to participate in our training camp, you have to be able to do 30 knee bends, 15 push-ups, 10 squats. Okay, well, I think we could all do that, right? I mean, so, and the bottom line was, please don't forget to bring your golf clubs to the training camp. So the whole idea back then was that, well, training camp is training camp. Like, this is when you get into shape to be able to play. And these days, the athletes, are year-round training and it's a problem too. The speed, you know, we're fascinated by it, and like you say, you sit next to the rink and you say, oh my God, I can't believe how quickly they're going in. But what hasn't changed is our physiology, what's underneath the muscles. And so we're seeing more in terms of serious injuries that we need to do something about speed, in other words. You know, we made rule changes across the game about 20 years ago that did away with interference. Okay, so a defenseman couldn't hold some forward up who was attacking, and what that's meant is now that forward who's going at full speed can skate as fast as possible, and if a defenseman's behind the net gathering the puck, well, consequences are much greater. So I think bring back hooking and holding.
Dan Abel has a question in the back.
Yeah. 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 Yes. Yes. Yeah. What a great, innovative and a force for change in many ways. He, I know about him especially because he played junior hockey in my hometown in St. Catharines, or senior hockey, I guess it was at that time when he was a Chicago Blackhawks player. But he was, exactly as you said, as a junior player, he was a ruffian. Spent more time in the penalty box than many did. And then, one of the training camps when he was with Chicago was suggested to him, look, you could actually play this game. And he did have that epiphany. The invention of the curve on the stick is an interesting story. And you hear old-time goaltenders talk about, before the days of the mask, that it created this, it was always some unpredictability about where a puck was going to go when it came off a stick. But now it was completely off the charts. Had no idea whether it was going to be, here or here or here or here. And so that creates a great advantage for the shooter, but it adds another element of danger to the game that we see with speed as well. So great for him and great for bringing up scoring and that sort of thing, but at the same time it adds just this kind of incremental factor of change that helps to change the game as well. Mikita came as a child, to Canada, and so and I'm not sure that the kind of cultural transfer of European, and he picked up the game in Canada as well. So yes, Slovakian by birth, but whether that meant cultural transfer in terms of the sport itself or not, I wouldn't say so. Yeah, great points.
Professor Jordan.
Thank you. So I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I feel like I have so many questions I could ask. Having grown up in a family with two older brothers and watched a lot of hockey over my life. One that comes to mind, watching hockey all my life is, and I think it's really important context to what we've been talking about with violence and safety. The fact that, back when there was these upsurges in violence, hockey players did not have to wear helmets.
Right.
So and then it slowly became over time, through the visor requirement and then the helmet requirement. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, the development of, the requirement to actually wear gear from clearly starting from bare knees.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Right.
But to discuss kind of over time that interplay, because clearly that's must have had a substantial, while there are these injuries still, that use of helmets.
Yes.
And developed over time, and thoughts and maybe some dates regarding regulations if you had them on hand.
Yeah, it's a great point, and we think now, how could they ever have played without helmets? And it's ridiculous, right? You just have to have one fall and bang your head and concussion and problems. Craig McTavish was the last NHL player to play without a helmet, and that was in the 80s. He was kind of grandfathered, so the NHL never came in and said, everybody wears helmets from now on if you started at a certain time. But the way these kind of equipment changes have taken place, it's usually worked through youth hockey and all their way up through junior hockey and then in the minor leagues. This is what happened with visors as well. And with cages, in NCAA, cages are worn. Now, it is controversial, all of this stuff, and we begin to see it's the 70s and 80s where the decisions to wear helmets or make them mandatory. Helmets and face protection makes it mandatory. And it's controversial because the question is, does that mean then that players will carry their stick higher because they know they're not going to do the kind of damage that they would have done had they done it if somebody has a bare face? And so this the debate has gone on. I know virtually every year somebody brings it up at the American Hockey Coaches Association meeting, and should we do away with the cages and bring back the visors because then players will feel like, well, we need to be more respectful of one another. If I respect you and not bring my stick up, then you won't either. And so the use of the term arms race might be a bit overblown, but there is a kind of a parallel there, isn't there, right? That And it's not just headgear as well. It's not just helmets and face masks. It also has to do with hard-shelled shoulder pads and hard-shelled elbow pads. You know, click, 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 click. Ooh, I wonder how much damage I could do if I'm skating at 100 miles an hour with that.
Just a quick follow-up, if I may. Was there a lot of controversy regarding the visibility aspect that there might as this requirement? And clearly, a lot of players, you know, surprisingly, to us, just didn't want to wear
Yeah.
the helmet instruction.
Yes.
But what about the debates regarding visibility and visors and different forms of things?
Yeah.
Quality of the game.
I would say that 95.9% of hockey players complained about having to wear the face gear for 2 days. Yeah, and then it's like, okay, well, this is the new normal, and you carry on. There's only anecdotal evidence about this. You know, you hear it from people you've played with or friends, or a journalist will interview somebody in a magazine and who's actually taken off the visor and say, well, why'd you do that? Well, I couldn't see, and but you know, so much in hockey history, I suppose, is anecdotal. That's hard to say for sure if there was a cross the board revulsion against or protest against that sort of thing. It's sort of the thing. The powers that be said, you've got to wear this face protection, and grumble, grumble, grumble. They did.
Can I follow up on that? Because you talk about the powers that be, but we're having this debate about American football, about concussions. As a former coach, what's the interplay of parents and youth hockey with the sport as it's played professionally? How do those two interact in terms of parents' willingness to support hockey culture? Because you have to be pretty dedicated to be a hockey parent, I think.
You do, yeah. Well, I think there's an increase in overall concern about among parents who whether their children should play or not. But it's hard to determine whether that's solely due to the danger factor. I mean, the fact is, it's expensive to play hockey. It's thousands of dollars to outfit even a young kid from feet to head, and so these sort of reasons for not allowing children to play are compounded. There's more of that in football, I think, than there is in hockey, just because it's just so much more overtly a violent game than hockey is. But from what I know, what I read, and what I hear, I think there is increasing concern. In Canada, there has been a kind of a leveling off of registrations for youth hockey players. And it's hard to know exactly. I think that's a factor. Another factor is that the complexion of Canada is just so much different today than it was before. And, you know, new Canadians don't have the same kind of bred in the bone, multi-generational attachment to the game, perhaps as others do. And so that's a factor, I think, too. So there's a lot of things in the wind that are arguing against this, you know, signing kids up for youth hockey. Well, one of the arguments Ken Dryden makes in his recent book is, you know, Mr. Bettman, parents are watching, you know, and you're the one who can make a difference here. If you can make the NHL less dangerous, if you can make it less dangerous by outlawing hits to the head completely across the board, doesn't matter circumstances, if you can make the NHL less dangerous by doing away with what we call finishing your check, okay, so the defenseman gets rid of the puck, and then one steamboat, two steamboat, three steamboats, boom, still gets hit. Yeah. Well, if you start calling that as interference instead of, he makes good arguments in saying that, then you'll reduce violence, and then you'll bring back the skeptics. Maybe.
Professor Duran and then Paul Corey.
I just want to follow up with a quick one on this. You know, I played American football. Actually, it's fairly violent. But there's something unique about hockey's violence. That is this fighting. And why is it continuing? Why is it? I know why it continues for the they get angry and they get into it. But as far as the powers that be, why do they continue to permit it? Is it that because at the professional level it attracts holders? Is that why it's permitted?
I think that's part of it. I think that's a big part of it. I also think that players and coaches and administrators honestly believe that where fighting exists in the game, it makes transgressors responsible for what they do. If they're a little liberal with their stick in terms of hooking or slashing or holding, then all it would take is for a fight or the threat of a fight. You know, Marty McSorley, one of the great fighters in hockey, used to say, "I used to sit on the bench like a battleship in the harbor. I don't actually have to be out there sailing about in order for my presence to be felt." The threat of a fight is as good as a fight. So those arguments, I think, are still very much believed by people. Bobby Orr, in his fairly recent autobiography, made a case for continuation of fighting in professional hockey, which is surprised me anyway. Yeah.
See, I think in general, sport, compared to football, the same thing. It put a few more rules about where you hit, how you hit, and so on.
Yeah.
Players would adjust to it. They'd complain, but they'd adjust to it.
Yeah.
For some reason, it's just difficult to get with.
Yeah. I think in hockey it's certainly that way too. The old guard has had its presence in the game for decades and decades and refuses to be moved. Yeah.
Paul.
Thanks for this. I'm a Montrealer who's played most of his life, so I think I know everything about the game. It's going to be very good to read the book, but I'm going to ask you. Going geographic, there's a leveling up. There's large chunks of the world where it could grow, and do you think they have an idea how to grow?
I do. Asia is where they want it, China in particular. There's a team in Kunlun, Red Star, that plays in the KHL right now, have been for 2 or 3 years. Mike Keenan, Iron Mike Keenan is the coach there. And you know, you've got to be a dedicated hockey player if you want to play there and fly to, what's the furthest team? Some team in Belarus. Sorry?
Well, probably Tursk or something.
Yeah. It's, you know, way far away. But we see also the Canadian Women's Hockey League now, this professional or semi-professional, if you want to call it, league has now got 2 women's teams in China. And this past season, the one just passed, not the current one, was the first year that they tried it out, and it's had some successes. Now, if you play on the Montreal Canadiens, the women's team, that means that you have to take 2 weeks out from your life in the middle of January or February and fly over to China to play a series of games against them and then fly back. So the schedules, working it out, are difficult. But the sheer size of the population, the fact that hockey has been played in China for quite some time, it's not as if it's just being discovered now, but in the northern province there, it's been around for some time. You know, the willingness to build infrastructure there, I think, is probably where, I know the NHL is dabbling with games. They had the Boston Bruins go over, for example. So yeah, China, Asia is a place where they're going to be looking, I think, for growth. I don't think the Southern experiment's over by any means, you know, mostly because you see the Toronto Maple Leafs of all teams, their very best player was born and raised in Phoenix. So what does that tell you? I mean, there's not just symbolism there, but but there's potential for growing the game in sunny places. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Does anybody want to weigh in? Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you. Question about race.
Yeah.
Why is hockey
Yeah. That's a great question. I didn't get to my race bit here, but I had an interesting story about an all-black team in my hometown, 1937-38 in St. Catharines, called the St. Catharines Orioles. Well, I'll invite you to. Hopefully, that section will be up on the Google part of the book. You can Google it and see. Yeah, hockey is the most white sport of all the major sports, and there have been efforts to try to change that, both in the United States and in Canada, through encouraging people of color to take up the game. When was it? 2008 was the 50th anniversary of Willie O'Ree breaking the color barrier in the National Hockey League. And so the National Hockey League took this up as a great moment of celebration, just as Major League Baseball had done with Jackie Robinson, except hockey hadn't made anywhere near the strides that Major League Baseball had made. And so it pushed some people to wonder what was the cause for celebration here. The fact is this, that hockey's bureaucracy, but also hockey's done not enough, I think, to encourage or to provide role models for players to come into the game, players, children in particular of color, to come and play hockey. And yeah, they're developing some role models now. I think P.K. Subban is a wonderful role. I think Wayne Simmons is a wonderful role model. And I think that, Jordan Tutu, other First Nations and Indigenous players are wonderful role models, but there are just so few of them. I don't know. I don't know whether it's a matter of being patient and waiting, or whether being impatient and waiting is just going to continue the cycle. There is one thing that has been concerned is that there's a kind of segmenting that exists in hockey, particularly true for Indigenous players, is that they tend to be the goons, or they tend to be the physical players. And whether that's built into coaches and scouts who are saying, okay, when we're looking at Indigenous players, we're only looking for those kind of players who are going to fill this role, or not, I'm not sure. But that kind of tracking or segmentation, I think, is discouraging. I hope it changes. Hockey's only impoverished by the fact that it's not more diverse than what it is. And leagues like the NHL have a lot of responsibility here for making that change. So, yeah. Yeah.
Well, the wonderful thing about any discussion of a book of history is the idea that a second edition can encapsulate some of these new trends. So we'll look forward to you coming back with the next edition. But for now, thank you so much, Andrew, for bringing your book and your learning, your knowledge of this great sport to here to Johns Hopkins SAIS.
Thanks, Chris. Much appreciated. Thank you.